Okay, so we're waiting for people to join this session. I've already posted. Let me just yeah, people are joining now. Hello, guys. We do apologize for the delays. We had a bit of technical issues with Stream, so we created a new link. Thank you for joining the session. So, Sir David, we are live now. So, hope you're doing well.
Yeah, man, it's been a really really crazy busy day. So apologies, I'm just trying to notify because I'm yet to the meetup group because we shared this link on the meetup group. So I'm trying to see if I can modify that with the new link in case anyone is trying to join with that information that we have for the previous with the previous link. So just a few minutes and I'll get on that. Just 1 minute, I'll quickly post the link there. So how are you doing today, though? How are you doing, Sakofi? Is it going okay?
Yeah, it's been a lovely day. Can't complain. So, it was busy in the morning for me, but as the afternoon came along, everything was nice and smooth. I hope you had a nice and smooth day as well.
You are always
Always busy. I know.
it's not been like the most straightforward, but yeah, it's sort of like it's sort of like okay. For some reason, I can't modify the link in the okay. Let me just put a comment. Yeah, so let me quickly put a comment here and go. Sorry. Yes, restream link broken. Yes, the new link. Okay, yeah, so I'll go ahead and just make some posts and then we'll
Okay.
make a start now. Yeah. So I'll also just quickly update my Twitter account because I think I sent people to the other link from the other one also. So I'll just quickly
Oh,
update that with the latest information. So let's go to that and let's go for here. So apologies, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll start shortly. So we're just quickly sorting out a few things with the link. So let's go. Yeah. Okay. Let's go live. Um, live now. Yeah. So Sakofi. Yeah. So what's going on? What are we doing today?
yeah. So today it is a new session. To put it frank, we are now doing the architects live studies, which a lot of people actually voted for. So hopefully, a lot of people will join in this session. I can see that a lot of people are quite interested in this one in particular. So for today, the first thing we're going to do is the design, authentication, and authorization. So, Sir David, up to you.
Yeah. So am I going to be getting like the Bitcoin soon?
Yeah,
The gold.
you know how it goes, right?
Yeah, what's going on? Bitcoin is not rising again. It's just been at the
Yeah,
at the level for a while now.
I mean, sometimes it goes down, other time it will go up. So probably let's give it a few more months.
So
But
are you suggesting that we buy the deep sarcophagus? Is that what you're
yeah,
saying?
but
Is
talk
that
about
what you're suggesting?
yeah.
Oh, okay.
The
Okay.
only way you actually get to green is when you buy it when it's what low.
I tell you something. I remember like someone. Okay, well that's like a different. Someone was telling me about chasing stock to the ground. Have you heard that phenomenon before, where people say they chase a stock to the ground?
Yeah,
So when the stock starts to drop, and
yeah.
then people think, "Oh, it's dropping. I can buy more," and then people buy more, and then
It
it keeps dropping, and
never
they
comes
chase
back out.
and they chase it all the way to the ground. So it's not fun. Well, yeah, that's sort of like the way that it goes. Okay, so today, so we actually have like less minutes now. We have about 45 minutes, so we'll see how we're going to structure that. So as Wasakov said, a lot of people voted for this particular this particular top certification, the solutions architect. So let's see what we're going to be covering, and let's see what that's about. So let's go first to AZ303 and AZ304. So I'll go ahead and share my screen now.
Okay.
So um, so I can see that my screen is showing now. So if we have a look at the AZ303 and the AZ304, so both certification exams make up the Azure Solutions Architect. And the path that we're going to be following in our live studies series, we're going to be following the path um, of the latest update. So there's an update that will be coming on July 26th, and the information about that is already published. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be a live study with the content that's described there. So let's have a quick look at some of this content that we're going to be going over. So what we're also going to be doing is we're going to be consolidating AZ303 and AZ304. We'll consolidate them together to a single just study session. So instead of breaking them down. So today we said we're going to be starting with implementing authentication and authorization. And here you can see some of the objectives that called out by Microsoft in terms of implementing Azure AD, in terms of authentication and authorization that we'll talk about. So in the AZ303, you can see that there's information about adding custom domains, configuring Azure AD identity protection, implementing self-service password reset, conditional access with MFA, fraud alert, verification methods, and on and on. And then some information about hybrid identity, right? So installing and configuring Azure AD Connect, synchronization options, and all that stuff. So that's part of what we need to cover for Azure Solutions Architect. If I go to the AZ304, there's also information about identity and security here. So you can see designing authentication. So recommending a solution for single sign-on authentication, conditional access, MFA, hybrid identity, and designing for authorization. You're talking about privileged identity management, identity protection, just-in-time access. So there's a lot of scattered objectives that we need to achieve, Sir Kofi. And what we'll try to do is today and tomorrow we'll try to consolidate all of this together, right, and walk through the objectives. So we're going to make this as practical as possible.
Yeah, that would be great. So after this session, people that want to take their 304 or also 303, this will give you the knowledge to take any of these two exams.
It would definitely help with your confidence. Yeah. So one of the things that we are working with Microsoft is to have a challenge so that we can share some challenge for you to also go through as we're going through this content. So, but it will definitely help with your confidence. So we're going to be covering today part 1 of designing authentication and authorization, and then we're going to cover part 2 of designing authentication and authorization tomorrow. And then next week, we'll go through the rest of the service. So we'll go through this and then we'll let you know what we're going to start. So today, what are we going to cover today? Let's start from there. So here's what we're going to look to cover today, Sir Kofi. So we're going to start by looking at Azure AD overview and just some Azure AD design decisions, right? So Azure AD overview and some Azure AD design decisions. So the reason why I like going for this approach, Sir Kofi, is this. When we talk about architecture, right? Architecture, when we're talking about we're architecting for something, because this is an Azure Solutions Architect. This is not about implementation. It's about designing something. It's about having sufficient knowledge to be able to gauge requirements and to be able to say, here is how I'm going to craft this together to meet this requirement. So that's what we're talking about, right? So the approach that we're going to take is this, Sir Kofi. What are the different architecture considerations that we need to have in mind? So we're going to be looking at topics like Azure AD Scalability, Azure AD Availability, Azure AD Performance, Azure AD Security Best Practices, Azure AD Monitoring, Azure AD Automation, Azure AD SLA. So you can see there's a lot of stuff that we're going to be covering here. But my hope is that by the end of tomorrow, you come away from this series feeling more confident about how to make design decisions when it relates to Azure AD. So this is unlike something that you've seen before, because a lot of courses just cover implementation, implementation, implementation. We'll share some information with you about how to do implementation. Sarkofi has been doing an amazing job of coming together with amazing labs that I can see many people are loving your labs, Sarkofi. Many people have been commenting on your labs. So great job on that. So what we're going to try to focus here is focus on the design aspect of things. So the first thing that we're going to start with today is, first of all, Sarkofi, there are two variants of Azure AD that exist out there. There are two main variants of Azure AD. We have Azure AD and we have Azure AD B2C. So both of them are similar services. They're built on the same underlying infrastructure, but they have different use cases from Microsoft. So we have Azure AD and we have Azure AD B2C. So some quick information about this. So they are separate product offerings from Microsoft. So Azure AD is a separate product offering from Azure AD B2C. Azure AD and Azure AD B2C are built on the same Azure AD infrastructure. So essentially they're built on the same underlying architecture. They both support the same industry standards. However, their use cases are different from each other. The use case for Azure AD Azure AD is different from the use case of Azure AD B2C. So let's have a look at very quickly the use cases for both of them. So for Azure AD, we're talking about this is built for the use case of business applications. So for example, Sarkofi has an amazing company that's thriving. Sarkofi has like maybe the stockbrokers that are working for him, maybe this, Bitcoin traders and stuff that are working for Sarkofi in his company. Sarkofi has business applications, how to transfer the millions, from one account to another, from Goldman Sachs to, is it Ghana National Bank? What's the main bank in Ghana, Sarkofi?
Ghana Commercial Bank.
Ghana Commercial Bank, there we go. Yeah. So Sarkofi needs to transfer and move all these funds around, So there's a business application that the different workers are using. So you want them to be able to use Azure AD for authentication. What you go for in that scenario is you go for Azure AD, not Azure AD B2C. Azure AD B2C, on the other hand, is what you go for when you have a customer-facing application scenario, right? Maybe you have like an e-commerce website, right? People can sign up for your website, right? They can shop on your website. It's not for it's not for internal users. It's for external customers. That's when Azure AD B2C, that's the use case for that. And you're going to see this if I go over to the Azure portal very, very quickly here. Let me go over to my Azure portal. So Microsoft recently modified like the view for Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. So they modified the view and you see the differences in sort of like how that's structured. So if I go over to my Azure portal and let's expand that a little bit for people that are watching. So what I can do, Sarkofi, is if I go to create a resource over here. So let's go to create a resource. Come on. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to type in Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory. And you can see that we have the two options here. We have Azure Active Directory. We have Azure Active Directory B2C. So that's how I can create an Azure AD tenant for business applications, Azure AD business to consumer tenant for customer-facing applications. So any other differences between these two variants of Azure AD, David? Yes. So for example, Azure AD B2C supports sign up and sign in workflow. What do we mean by that? So Sarkofi, if you have your private and your e-commerce website, you probably want users to be able to sign up, right, to your website without having to contact you, right?
That's right.
Yeah. But if you have like a corporate application, right? So for example, the company that you're working in, the company has a corporate application that you use for sales called probably Salesforce. Would you like users to be able to sign up by themselves without contacting an admin?
For business application, like Salesforce,
Yeah.
I think probably not.
Yeah. So that's what this is about. Because if you look at the scenarios that this supports a sign up workflow. You have your website, you've linked your website with Azure AD. People can go to your website and click on sign up, and this is going to redirect them to Azure AD, and they're going to go through a sign up scenario where they can go ahead and create an account for themselves. Maybe they even have like a Facebook account or maybe a Gmail account. They can link it up to automatically create an account for themselves to be able to use your application. But that identity that they're creating is stored in Azure AD. It's stored in Azure AD B2C, but they can do a sign-up workflow, a sign-in workflow without involving an admin. However, for Azure AD, the identities are usually created by administrators.
All right. So
if you
with
remember,
Azure AD B2C, when they sign in, are there? So when they sign up, the account that will be created will be a guest account on Azure.
So it won't be a guest account. So it's a different scenario. So for example, if I go over here, let me actually go create an Azure AD B2C tenant. So, and then you see like it looks similar, but it's a different use case. So with this one, it just has users, right? So with the other one, it's a bit of a different use case in terms of what you're really using it for, right? So you can see you can enable login with social media identities, essentially just like normal user account, but it's just going to be Azure AD behind it. So if I go to create that, so a popular company that uses this is Real Madrid in Spain. So the La Liga Football Club. So they have a mobile application that their fans can use, and the identity provider for that is Azure AD B2C.
All right.
Yeah, so you can see I can go to create a new Azure AD B2C tenant over here. And if I go to create a new Azure AD B2C tenant, come on. Let's go. I can specify the name of the organization. So let's say Coffee Gold Limited. No. So initial domain name, Coffee Gold. And location, let's get location to the United Kingdom, and let's go that, right? And then we can go create. And what does it not like? It does not like something. Okay, here we go. Let's put this into a new resource group very quickly. Let's just call it Azure AD B2C group. Come on. And resource group location, let's just put that in UK South. Create that and create. So that's going to create an Azure AD B2C tenant.
I think something about
it. No, it's okay. So what this is complaining about is complaining about the resource provider. So that's easy. We can fix that very easily, very quickly. So what we can do is we can go to my Azure subscription over here. So that's the concept of the resource provider. So it's complaining about, hey, your resource provider is not registered. So let's go to fix that. So let's go to Azure Portal and let's go to subscriptions. Coffee, by the way, did you know that there's a semiconductor shortage in the world? Have you heard that news?
No. Oh yeah,
there is.
I think quite recently I heard. I mean, obviously these will affect products that obviously rely on these silicons like mobile devices. So I'm guessing I don't know if the price will shoot up or it's just going to be a shortage of these products.
Yeah, it's strange. So what reminded me was, I'm going to try to get a new laptop because my laptop is getting very slow, right? Yeah. I was like, I need to get myself. So that's what it's complaining about, because that resource provider is not registered. So I registered that resource provider. Yeah. So, so I was going to try to get a different laptop, and the laptop spec I wanted to get is like, no, it's it's out of stock. And the reason for that is because there's of the semiconductor shortage in the world, apparently.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So maybe that's a different business for Sarkozy now, Maybe I'm sure that we can use gold to. Can we not use gold?
Yeah. I mean, many all the electronics rely on these, so it's going to be an interesting one if it stays. I mean, that way.
Do we know which countries in the world are like the largest that for producing semiconductors? Do we know?
Definitely China. China will be part of it.
Will be one of the top ones.
Yeah.
They'll probably be raking in a lot of money.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is a shortage of semiconductors in the world. Yes, that's right, James. So that's the reason. Yeah, wait time for like PlayStation. Yeah, apparently, yeah, it's true. So yeah, wait for like a lot of product actually. So essentially, if you're able to get that, okay, I think that's where we fix this hopefully. So if not, I'll just move on and we can come back to it later. So let's go back to the tenant, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go a step back. So let's go back a little bit, and let's try that option. And I'm going to try that one more time. If it succeeds, then that's good. If not, we're just going to move on Sarkozy.
Okay.
So let's go create a new Azure AD B2C tenant. And again, for this one, it's Coffee Gold Limited. It's Coffee Gold on Microsoft.com. Just leave it in United States. That's fine. I'll just leave it the way that we have it. Let's go ahead and try to create it now. And hopefully that goes through. So that's going to take a few minutes. So we'll come back to that when that's finished creating, right? Yes. You know what? Because David, I'm telling you, this man that we are speaking to, you have no idea. I have no idea why he's doing this. He's a made man. This man right here is a made man.
David can see that you're putting me on the spot on this.
It's true. He's a made man, man. The guy enjoys. The last time I saw my wife visited, you've not seen this type of chicken before. It's a different type of chicken. I tell you, I'll take a picture of this time. Okay, so back to Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. So one of the differences that you also see is because of the different use cases at Coffee is that the licensing method is different. For Azure AD, we pay licensing on a per user basis, right? So I have 100 users. I purchase maybe Azure AD premium license for the 100 users, and I assign the license to individual users. On Azure AD B2C, the pricing is different. We pay for what is called monthly active users. And monthly active users means how many users have successfully authenticated in a month, right? So that's what we pay for. So, and that makes sense, right? So if you have people signing up for your website and Azure AD is behind the authentication behind that, would you like to assign 1 million licenses to 1 million users? Probably not, right? That would be ridiculous. Because then you have to buy 1 million licenses if 1 million people sign up for your website. However, what you do is that if 1 million people successfully authenticate to your website in a month, then you pay for that price based on the number of people that successfully authenticated. So that's what you pay for. So I hope that it's getting clear in terms of the different use cases for these services.
Yeah. So essentially, the Azure AD B2C means when a user actually use the service, because for them to successfully authenticate, they have to use it. Yeah. And then they get charged.
Exactly. Exactly. And actually, you do get free allocation from Microsoft also. So let me go back over here. So while this is still creating, so let me just go to Azure AD B2C pricing. So you see that you actually get a ridiculous amount of free capabilities every month. So you get 50,000 monthly active users for free. So essentially 50,000 users every month, and that's every month regardless for free. So anything above 50,000, the first 50,000 authentication, successful authentication, successfully authenticated users, then you pay for that. And that's the amount that you pay. Yep. Okay.
So hopefully that makes sense. So in terms of those two variants, so when we're using business applications, that's the use case, and if we have customer-facing applications, we use that. So I'll cover this in a bit more details later, but let's get into some other design topics today. So the first design topic that we'll look at with Azure AD Sarkofi is Azure AD Scalability. So let's talk about that very quickly. So when we talk about scalability, the definition is the ability of a service to expand to meet increasing demands, right? So
That's
there's
right.
more demand that's coming on the system. We want our service that we're building, we want it to be able to accommodate demand as it grows. When we talk about scalability in the context of Azure AD, the responsibility mainly belongs to Microsoft because it's a managed service, right? It's not a service that we look after the underlying architecture. However, it's a service that we use. So it's mainly Microsoft's responsibility. So, but how does it work? How does scalability work in Azure AD? So here's how it works, Sakofi. Azure AD uses a distributed data tier across multiple data centers. So, and let me just go ahead and bring up the screen so you can see that. So what it does is that they have data tier that's distributed across multiple data centers. So these are data center boundaries. They have that distributed across multiple data center boundaries. So that's a distributed data tier. So that's where your data will be written. So for example, you create a new user account, a user signs up if you're using Azure AD B2C, all those types of stuff, all those are stored in that distributed data tier. So then
Does the end user get any? I mean, the option to select which data center it stores their data.
So when you're creating it, it's not necessarily like the so what you do is you select the region, not necessarily like the data center. So you notice that like when I was creating even the Azure AD B2C tenant, it asked me and it says what country or region, right?
Oh,
And it just goes, but it didn't ask me to select is it going to be East US or West US or North US or whichever one. I just go, I want my region is United States and data center location is United States, and it's going to have a distributed data tier that's spread across multiple regions in United States.
okay,
That
all
makes
right.
sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's the same for whether it's Azure AD or Azure AD B2C. It's the same. So you have this distributed tier, and this distributed tier it has distributed front end services that's distributing requests to them. So, for example, Sarkofi goes to the Azure portal and you say, I want to create a new user account called Rose, right? So Sarkofi is going to create a new user account called Rose. And whenever you craft that operation in the Azure portal, that operation will be handled by the distributed front end services that will decide to route your request and decide to write your request on any of the distributed data tier, right? So that's sort of like how that works. So request routing is handled by the distributed front end services.
And is there any specific logic to it where it writes to?
So the way that it works is this. So let me bring this up. So typically there's an active primary and a passive primary. And then there's secondary replicas in many data centers. So the way that works is write request primarily goes to the active primary, which has a distributed front-end services and distributed data tier. So it's not just one, they're all distributed, right?
Okay.
So write requests will always go here. And then once write requests are written, they will be written over here to the passive primary. If there were to be a failure over this, the passive primary takes over and begins to handle your write request. You don't need to do anything. That's transparently redirected to the passive primary, which is again has distributed front-end services and distributed data tier. Read operations, which is by far the majority of things that you do with Azure AD. Think about it, there's more read than write in Azure AD. Right? It's not every day that you're creating user account, right? Or updating user account, but it's every day that you're making authentication requests. Authenticate this user, check, give this user an access token to access this service. So by a large magnitude, you're doing more read operations. And the way that scalability works is that it's distributed your data across multiple data tiers in secondary replicas, and that's how it scales. So if a million requests is coming in, it can be serving that simultaneously across multiple different data stores. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how it does scalability. So essentially, it can scale to handle increasing performance demands because the data tier is distributed, and that's something that multiple requests can be handled in parallel. Some other considerations when it comes to scalability for Azure AD. So considerations around user objects. So a user can belong to a maximum of 500 Azure AD tenants. That's a lot, probably. Maybe for like an organization that may be a bit smaller, but a user can only belong to 500 Azure AD tenants. If you remember, Sakofi, in the administrator course, we talked about we can create users in Azure AD, but we can also invite users from other Azure AD tenants into Azure AD.
That's
so
right.
if you're being invited into multiple Azure AD tenants, you can only be invited into up to 500.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's how that works. So you can create a maximum of up to 200 Azure AD tenants is what you can create. So when it comes to groups, so when we talked about Azure Administrator, the implementation service that we did last time, if you've yet to watch that, go watch the video recording and watch Sakofi's labs on that. So Sakofi had a lab on dynamic group creation. So we can have a maximum of 5,000 dynamic groups, which is a lot, right? However, if you're like a large company like Microsoft, Sakofi, right, where you have, how many employees does Microsoft have? How many employees do you think Microsoft has, Sakofi? How many do you think?
Probably 100,000. I won't be surprised.
Yeah, probably. Oh, by the way, here's a big one. What do you think is the largest employer in the world? What do you think? Largest employer?
Amazon.
Let's see. No, it's not Amazon. You'll be surprised at this one, Sakofi. You'll be surprised.
IBM.
No, I think that it's probably like the US military or something like that. Oh. Yeah, there you go. US Department of Defense, 3.2 million employees. But of course, that's a large military base, right? Yeah. So then you're followed by the People Liberation Army in China, then followed by Walmart, that is 2.2 million and stuff.
Yeah,
right?
That's impressive. So,
yeah, if you think about it, probably 5,000 dynamic groups is not a lot if you have 2.2 million. On this, right? And maybe you have Walmart, Francisco, and maybe you have a different dynamic group for them or whatever. So it depends on how your organization is structured. That may not be a lot. So that may be something you consider when you're thinking about, do I have one Azure AD tenant in my organization or do I have multiple? Right. So just be aware of that. So a non-administrative user can create a maximum of 250 groups. So you see that many organizations allow their groups for collaboration, right? So a user can only create up to 250 groups. A maximum of 100 users can be owners of a single group. So when you're creating a group in AD and you're specifying the owner for the group, you can only have up to 100 users as the owner. Again, if you're like a company like Microsoft, maybe some of your group you want to have more ownership than 100, so that can be a bit tricky. So just be aware of these limitations when it comes to scalability. When it comes to service principle, a maximum of 100 users can be owners of a single application, right? So that's sort of like how that works. So again, we'll discuss some of this further, but let's move on to the next topic because of time. So next topic that we're going to talk about, Sakofi, is availability. So that's scalability. We understand that Azure AD uses a distributed tier. But how does availability work with Azure AD? So let's go over that very quickly, Sakofi. Number one, availability is talking about the ability of a service to perform uninterrupted, right? So that's what we're talking about. Have you designed your service in such a way that if there were to be a failure over here, your service can perform without being interrupted? Again, a lot of availability responsibility in Azure AD falls in the hand of Microsoft. And the reason for that is because of the architecture that we described earlier, Sakofi, because of the architecture. Yeah. So that's the reason behind that. So because what happens is that whenever a write request comes in, and that goes to your active primary cluster, right, to write your data on the distributed tier, before the write request is acknowledged back to your client, is going to make sure that it replicated this to at least this data center. to the passive primary before it actually goes back and says, I'm going to acknowledge that request back to you. Right. So that way, it's not as if, oh, I just modified the user's password, but then it got lost. Right. So before it actually goes, I've modified user password successfully modified. When you see that message in the portal, it means it's written to do 2 data centers in your region. Right. So that's how that works. So that's really handled by Microsoft. It's not really our responsibility. Some other availability considerations, though, Azure AD has a SLA of 99.9%. For if you're using Azure AD Office 365 Edition or Microsoft 365 Edition or Azure AD Premium P1 and Premium P2 Edition, you have an availability SLA of 99.9%. What does that translate to? Let's see. Availability calculator. Let's see what that translates to, Sir Coffee. 99.9%. Here we go, 99.9%. What that means is that it can go down for about 43 minutes in a month.
Right.
And in a year, it can go down for about 8 hours in a year.
So what about in the case something happened and then it violated the SLA? What do they have in place? Do they offer free credit
This
or
is
what?
what will happen. Anything that violates the above can be claimed as service credit.
Okay.
Yeah, so they'll give you service credit back in terms of that. So, but however, you must also understand what Microsoft calls available. Because when Microsoft says, we guarantee you that this is going to be available 99.9% of the time, what is your definition of available, Microsoft? So here's Microsoft's definition of available. It's actually not bad. If your users can log into the service, they can log into the access panel, which makes sense because the main use case of Azure AD is for authentication, right? So they can authenticate. Good. So that is available. If IT administrator can create, they can create account, read account, write delete account, and update account and all that stuff. So these are the two definitions that Microsoft calls available. As long as these two can happen, right? So that's what they call as available in their definition. And anything that violates that can then be claimed as a service credit back.
All right.
Yeah. So hopefully that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. Yeah.
I don't see anybody asking any questions yet, but we'll see.
Yeah,
So let's go.
Do they have any websites that check the status of various services like the AD?
Oh, yes. So we're going to get to monitoring in a minute. So let me see if we can get to monitoring today. Let's see. Yeah, I think we should be able to get to some monitoring today and stuff. So let's go back. So before we get to monitoring, let's quickly talk about security considerations of Azure AD. So this has finished creating, I'm sure. I think we just need to refresh it so that we can manage it. So I'm sure it's finished creating. Come on, Azure AD B2C. Let's go. Okay, I'm just going to go search for Azure AD B2C. It's a bit slow. Really, really slow. Here we go. It's taking its time. Let's go ahead and click on Azure AD B2C. I think it's already created it. It's just not displaying it. B2C. There we go. Come on, where's our tenant? Okay, so for some reason, I think it's probably not created that. Let's see. So coffee. Oh, okay, it's created it. So here we go. So that's the directory. So let's switch over to that. So let's go switch over to that directory and let's see. I just want to quickly show you what B2C looks like. We'll cover that in a bit more details later. So let's go to this one. Sir Coffee. Um, yeah, we're
Yeah.
going to be having like an event. Okay, yeah, I was going to ask you a question, but yeah, so we'll have a subscription. You know what? I'll come back to this one because of I don't want this to really delay our time. So it seems like it's created it, but it needs a link to a subscription. So we'll come back to that. In the meantime, let's go quickly to Azure AD Security. So when it comes to Azure AD Security, number one consideration is we want to add in Azure AD default configuration. So that's the first thing that we want to do.
How do
So
you,
yeah, good question. So what do we mean by adding Azure AD default configuration? So if I go over to the Azure portal and let's go to Azure AD, I'm going to have to switch this back. Oh, by the way, this is what, okay, just created an Azure AD tenant. I'll go ahead and delete that. So one of the things to mention, Sakofi, I'll explain this to you later. So Microsoft added a capability called external identities to Azure AD, which essentially extend Azure AD to be like like Azure AD B2C capabilities for Azure AD, right? But that's not what we are going to be talking about. So we'll come back to that later, but just be aware that there's something called external identities,
Right.
which extends some Azure AD B2C capabilities for Azure AD. So let me go ahead and switch this back in terms of my directory. So let's go to switch the directory and let's switch back to my normal directory. So I want to show you what I mean by security consideration of Azure AD. Make sure you add in Azure AD default configurations. So what many people don't ask themselves that question, Sakofi, is what are the default configurations in Azure AD? When I create an Azure AD tenant, what are the default configurations? You know, default configuration is one of the things that causes a lot of trouble for people in security, right? People leave default username and password, and then they get into trouble and all that stuff. So what are the default configurations? Let's look at some of them. If I scroll down here, if I go to under user settings, so let's look at default user settings configuration of Azure AD. If you have a look at this, Kofi, users can register applications. So that's talking about, can users in your organization, can they register service principals, right? By default, that is yes. That may not be a bad thing. So maybe you have developers in your organization and you want your developers to be able to register applications. That's fine, right? Essentially, you allow them to create identity, to create application identity. But by default, that is not restricted. That is available to every single user, right? If you have a look at this, restrict access to Azure AD administration portal. It's no by default. So what that means is that any user in your organization can log into the Azure AD portal. Is that necessarily bad? Not really, because a lot of the data that they can see when they access the Azure AD administration portal, they can see from, let's say, from Skype for Business. So for example, I can see maybe Sakofi's manager, or maybe I can see Sakofi's team. A lot of that information comes from Active Directory, from Azure AD. So, you know, that may not be considered a big security issue. But then if you go further down, can they connect their LinkedIn account to Azure AD? By default, that's yes. You have to decide, is that what you want in your organization, right? Let's go a bit further. Let's go to external user settings. Let's look at what external users can do by default. So external users, do they have the same permission as member users? So that is not set by default. However, they'll have limited access to properties and membership of directory objects. Who can invite guests in your organization? Anyone in the organization can invite guest users, including guests. Look at that, Sakofi.
yeah. Yeah, that's something that you have to definitely.
Yep. So Sakofi can invite me as a guest into your Azure AD organization, and I can turn around and invite Aman or David as a guest into your organization. So guests can invite other guests by default. So that's the default of Azure AD. So what's the reason for that? Because these defaults are not set with security or governance in mind. They are set with collaboration in mind, right? This allows us to collaborate massively, right? So that's why these settings are put in place by default, right? So allow allow people to invite users from which domains. By default, users can invite users from any domain. So that is unrestricted by default. So I can invite user from any Azure AD tenant anywhere in the world, or even any Microsoft account into this domain by default. Is that what you want? You have to decide.
That's right.
So that's what we mean, Sakofi, when we say, make sure you look at your default configuration and make sure you check that that's really what you want in your organization.
All right, we got a few questions. Let me just bring it up on the screen.
Yes, sir.
Herman said, does Azure AD support any XML 2.0 identity provider, and such can import identity from external sources?
Yes, is the answer to that. So it does. So it does support SAML identity provider. You can import identity from external sources. So Azure AD supports two main. Yeah, so it supports OpenID Connect, supports SAML version 2.0, and it supports OAuth for authorization framework. In terms of that, it also actually supports WS-Fed. So it supports that. Yeah.
Okay, we got another one here. So David said, how do I integrate Azure AD in my code to enable login on my application as a developer?
David, you should have voted or gotten people to vote for the Azure Developer course. So I won't go into like a lot of details, but yeah, so this is covered in the Azure Developer course. And I'll show you an easy way to answer that question, David. So here's the easy way for you to understand how to do that, David. So easy way to do that, go to your Azure AD tenant. In your Azure AD tenant, go to application registration and go register an application. So whenever you want people to be able to sign into your application using Azure AD or whatever scenario you want to implement, you have to register your application in Azure AD. So the first thing that you need to do, David, go to register your application in Azure AD. So I'm not going to register one. I have one here called Custom App. So I've registered my application in Azure AD. Open the application that you've registered and then go under Quick Start. So what I like about this Quick Start option is that it's going to help you with the scenario that you're trying to implement. So it's like, David, what are you trying to do? Are you building a web application? Is it a mobile application? Is it a single page application? Is it a daemon application? Because the authentication flow scenarios varies depending on the type of application that you're building, right? So the flow that you need to implement for a desktop application is different from the flow for a single page application. It's different from the flow for a web application. So let's say you're building a web application, David, you can select the web application that you're building, web application. You can select your platform. So maybe you're building an ASP.NET Core web application, and then it's going to walk you through the client library that you need to implement, which is Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. So that's the latest version of the Azure AD client library. So much newer than ADAL, which is the Azure AD Authentication Library, which is the legacy version. So, and it's going to walk you through a code sample of what you need to do. So it's going to walk you through a code sample in terms of this is what your flow would look like for the scenario that you're implementing. Users use a web browser to connect to your application. Your application redirects them to Azure AD, which is Microsoft Identity Platform. Azure AD is going to authenticate their request and it's going to provide them with an access token. And then that access token will be provided to your application and your application can validate that. So, and it tells you the classes that you're in, that you need to implement for Microsoft Authentication Library. But again, this is not the Azure Developer course. So next time, David, what you need to do is get a lot of people to vote for Azure Developer and we can cover this.
Wow, that was amazing.
Yeah.
All right, we got Opaymi also asking a question here. Let me bring it up on the screen. It said, does Azure AD B2C support single sign-on?
Very good question. Does it support single sign-on? It can. It can. Because at the end of the day, if you look at sort of like the scenario that it supports, it's supporting basic scenarios like SAML and the other scenarios and stuff. It can, but it's not one that you see readily implemented. But yeah, it can. So a good scenario where that may be useful is if you're using something like API management. So I've seen organizations link their Azure AD with Azure AD B2C for API management, and then they can have single sign-on implemented in that scenario. So it can, but it's not one that you say that's commonly implemented.
All right, got think this one is in support of what you're saying. And so this seems like it's applicable for authentication in microservices, perhaps using API.
So I'm not sure like what you mean by it's applicable. Are you referring to Azure AD? Are you referring to Azure AD B2C? Are you referring to what? So yeah, but if the question is just Azure AD, yes, it's definitely applicable for authentication in a microservice. So you can definitely do that. So there are multiple ways to implement this architecture in Azure. So an easier way maybe to have your application, your endpoint coming through API management, because then you can manage your APIs at scale. So, but then in API management, I don't believe I have an API management instance here. But in API management, what you can do is you can integrate API management with either Azure AD or Azure AD B2C. So API management support integration with both Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. So for example, maybe the API that you're exposing for consumption is for your internal business users. Sometimes the API that you're enabling is for your external customers, right? So it supports integration with both. I don't have an API management service to show that to you, but yeah, definitely Azure AD is definitely applicable for authentication in microservices scenarios like APIs. Okay, I think that we ran out of time, Sir Kofi. It's very sad.
Yeah, it's exactly 7 o'clock. So
yeah, because we started a bit late today. Yeah. So what I'm going to share with you from tomorrow is that I'm going to complete information about security. So we share some information around that. So I'll finish security. I'll talk about monitoring for Azure AD. So how we design for monitoring for Azure AD, we're going to cover that. We'll talk about some recovery. So recovery means the ability to recover in the instance of a failure. So we'll talk about recovery at different levels. Recovery at the tenant level, recovery of your users and your objects and your configuration. So maybe in case your configuration gets corrupted, and recovery sort of like on access level. So recovery of your access if you accidentally lock yourself out and all those kind of stuff. So we'll talk about that. And I'll see if I can show you like some scenario with Azure AD B2C a bit more tomorrow. But we promised ourselves that we're going to stick to 1 hour. So it's 7 o'clock, so we have to stop. So we'll pick it up from here tomorrow. So Sakofi, you're going to be having labs for the people, right? We're going to have labs for the people at some point.
Yeah, at some point we will definitely introduce the lab. So just bear with us. Today's session we don't have a lab, but I promise you will come up with labs. So I believe you all enjoyed this wonderful session from Sir David. I've learned a lot from it, and I hope everyone else also learned something from it, 1 or 2 from this session. So thank you, Sir David. Thank you once again.
No problem, sir. Always a pleasure. And I tell you, David Emmanuel, you see the chicken. When you see the chicken that Sarkozy served me and my wife, you know what I'm talking about. This man doesn't serve the normal food that people eat in their own houses. I tell you something. Somebody said something.
I'll make sure that Rose hear about this.
Oh, wow. It's amazing. Somebody said something. Somebody said, I think it was Bill Gates' daughter, said, when did you know that your dad was like really rich? He said, when my friends started coming to our house, and when they got to our house, they looked at sort of like the chandelier and they were like, whoa, how many lights are in that chandelier? And he was like, no, this is normal to us. That's exactly how I felt in Sarkoph's house. It was like, whoa, where did you get this chicken from? It's like, I eat this type of chicken every day. This is normal to me. I was like, wow.
Yeah, so Herman is asking, is this session recorded? Yeah, it definitely is recorded on this same channel. So you can definitely rewatch it at any time you want.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks very much,
Thank you, guys. We'll see you tomorrow. Not next week, tomorrow. So make sure you're joining tomorrow. All right, bye.
Bye-bye.